It is May 21st, 2024, and reports are saying that the EU is giving the green light to the plan to take the interest from the frozen Russian assets that they currently have within the Union and to use it to benefit Ukraine. In fact, 90% of it is going to go into what they're calling a peace fund to be used for military aid for Kiev. I mean, what a time we live in when you literally have the EU saying that they are going to take Russia's money and they are going to use it to give it to Ukraine to attack Russia. But that is what they are doing, as they are, of course, under a lot of pressure from the US and the UK, the other countries that don't have the bulk of the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets within their grasp. And so they are turning to the EU, the bloc that does have the majority of those funds, and they're calling on them to at least seize the interest generated from the assets in order to use it as support for Ukraine. But when you look at the numbers, I mean, it's only expected to be up to about 27 billion euros between now and 2027. And let's be honest here, that isn't even a drop in the bucket for Ukraine and for what they currently are requesting from their Western backers. We got into all of that and more earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. George, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
It's my pleasure, Rachel.
Now, I want to get into the latest here. I know that the foreign minister of the Czech Republic confirmed that the EU has agreed to use the proceeds from frozen Russian assets that the bloc has, of course, frozen to aid Ukraine. The annual revenue from these funds is expected to be around $3 billion. Are you surprised by this move? I know we've had talk about it for months now, but are you surprised that they're actually going through with it?
No, I always thought that they would go through with it for the simple reason that the Americans were applying a great deal of pressure against Europe. And the Americans, of course, want to take it much further. The Americans actually want to pick up the $3 billion in frozen assets and hand it all over to Ukraine. The drawback for the Americans is that only a very small proportion of that money actually is in the hands of the United States. The rest, most of it, is under the control of the Europeans. Nonetheless, the Americans have been applying a great deal of pressure on the Europeans to just give everything to Ukraine. So the Europeans had to placate the Americans somehow. So they came up with this ingenious formula whereby they can say, well, we're not actually stealing these assets. We're just helping ourselves to the interest earned on the assets, and we're going to hand the interest earned to Ukraine. The problem is it's still theft. I mean, whichever way you look at it, it's theft. It's not your money, and therefore the earnings on that money doesn't belong to you. So it's still theft. It's just not theft on the scale envisaged by the United States.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part of it too, is that, as you were bringing it up there, this is almost kind of a compromise. I mean, you had several EU members, including Germany and France, who were said to be resisting pressure from the US and the UK to outright confiscate the Russian assets, citing concerns that such a drastic move would have no legal basis, yet they're just fine taking the interest on it. Is this really about the pressure that's coming from the US? And granted, the EU could just say no. I mean, they have the bulk of the assets there within the Union. They could easily say, no, we're not going to do that. But what do you make of them essentially caving to US pressure on this one?
Well, when haven't they caved to US pressure? When have they said no? I am having difficulties recalling an episode in which they said no on any consistent basis. I mean, they may say no on Monday. By Tuesday, it's maybe. Wednesday, all right, have it your way. Thursday, hey, we're even more enthusiastic than you are. So that's the pattern with the Europeans. So incidentally, that for that very reason, I'm not at all sure that the Europeans are going to stop at that. This is just a holding maneuver to relieve the pressure that's coming from the United States. So they say, yeah, we're doing something, but we're not wholly undermining the global financial order. We're still showing that we respect private property. We're still showing that we respect the banking laws and the rules of finance. So we're not giving the whole thing over. We're just handing over the interest earned. But of course, they're not respecting the global financial transactions order. They're basically just handing over money that doesn't belong to them. I mean, that's as simple as that. You're giving money, and above all, you're also giving money that doesn't belong to you, and you're giving that money to the adversary of the power that the one that actually owns these assets, and it's with a view that they can spend it on military purposes. So in other words, Russian money will be used in order to kill Russians. Well, that sounds as if it's entirely in accord with legality and the the rules-based order. You're taking Russians' money in order that it can be used to kill Russians. Okay, well, that sounds good. I mean,
Right.
I'm sure the European lawyers can feel pleased with themselves that they've really come up with this sound formula.
Right. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it in that way, but you're right. And it sends a message to all the rest of the world that this could also happen to you. I know that's something that Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov brought up and highlighted. Look, warning the West of dire ramifications if it taps into Moscow's assets. He said that such a move will create a dangerous precedent that will be a solid nail in the future coffin of the entire Western economic coordinate system. Now, I know that, some people may look at that and they may say, oh, that's a little drastic. But I mean, the message that it's sending to the rest of the world is not only are your assets not safe, but that money can be seized and given to your adversary to then use back against you.
Yes, that's exactly the message. And that, of course, is the message that the Americans are very happy to convey, because the Americans are very happy to undermine Europe's position in the global financial order, because it's Europe who's going to have to carry the can. It's Europe who's going to show to the world that the money that you leave in the banks of Europe isn't safe. You think, this money is safe. Well, it isn't safe. And this money can be used for whatever purposes the governments of Europe may decide. And again, they're going to be maybe used against you. Now, remember what happened with in the case of Venezuela, when this gold bullion that was stored in the Bank of England, the government of the UK said, well, we're keeping it. You're not getting it back. We're just going to have it. And however much the Venezuelan government pursued legal action against the government of the UK, the courts, as you would expect in the UK, kept ruling in favor of the British government. And the British government is actually planning on giving this, I think, £1 billion, which is what the value of that gold bullion. They were going to give it to this guy, Juan Guaido, whom the British, the Europeans, and the Americans decided to accord the title of President of Venezuela, even though he had never run for election. He hadn't been elected to anything. They decided he was the president. Well, where is Guaido now? I mean, he's teaching in some university in Florida. So they were planning to give this money to someone who's been kicked out of his country and is teaching in some university in Florida. Now, when you do things like that, you're really undermining confidence in your banking system. I mean, the British got rich in the world because people had confidence in the British banking system. The British were the dominant banking and financial power in the world. People had confidence. They don't have confidence anymore. People are going to think, well, I better put my money somewhere else, because they're going to, I'm next in the pecking order. If they can do that to Russia, how much more likely are they going to do it to me?
Yeah, you may not have $300 billion in assets, but if you're a smaller country, you have less. that still has a significant impact. Now, speaking of that impact, it's almost kind of sad that we're getting to this point that, you look at what Ukraine may actually be getting out of this. So, under this agreement, reports say that 90% of the proceeds will go into an EU fund for military aid for Ukraine, with the other 10% going to support Kiev in other ways. The EU expects that assets will yield up to 20 billion euros in profits by 2027. Now, I never thought I'd be in a position of saying 27 billion euros is nothing, but for Ukraine, given everything it's facing right now, that amount of money, not all up front right now, but between now and 2027, is virtually nothing. So, what is the significance of this decision if it's not going to lead to any, military victories on the battlefield? What is the significance for Kiev if there is any?
Well, the significance is they intend to keep the war going. They intend to keep finding money from whatever source, and that fund that you talked about, where the 90% is going to go, it's got this wonderful title, the European Peace Initiative. It's peace. When you spend money on weapons, it's called peace. It's the Peace Initiative, and it has a wonderful Orwellian title. Well, I think that's the point with this money. Money is fungible. I mean, if you spend money on one thing, it frees up money to be spent somewhere else. So it's the same way with the $61 billion that the Americans recently came up with. Yeah, 61 billion. It doesn't mean it amounts to that much, but it means that in 2, 3, 4 months' time, the Biden administration is going to come back to Congress and say, we'd like another 60 billion. Maybe this time it'll be more. Maybe, we always have to keep upping it. How about 100 billion? And if you've already said yes to 60, what's the basis for saying no to 100? I mean, you've already, in principle, you've accepted that this is a bottomless well, and you're going to keep dumping money into a bottomless well. So why not dump some more? So, and as I say, I think that it's not going to end with this thing of the Europeans, this compromise that they come up with. The Americans are not going to be placated. That's just not the way they are. They said, okay, well, that's a good first step. But we need a lot more than that. I mean, these sums are negligible. They're going to use your argument. It's just not enough. You've got to use the rest of this money, because who's going to pay for all this weaponry they need? Who's going to pay for all this reconstruction other than Russia? And that's that's the argument. They're going to say, look, we are never going to give this money back to Russia. You accept that? And the Europeans will say, yeah, of course we're never going to give this money back. And we all accept it. That 300 billion is never going to be returned to Russia. So you can either give them all the money to the Ukrainians now, or you can give it to them next year or the year after. But eventually you're going to give it to them. So why not give it now?
Yeah, you see that mission creep kind of in play. The US is very, very good at that. Now, you would think that maybe Zelensky would be having a good day with this news. I mean, granted, as you were pointing out, it basically shows that the US and the EU are going to continue standing by Kiev. But according to reports, Zelensky is having quite the opposite. He is apparently, as you have Kiev's forces crumbling on the battlefield around the Kharkov region, you've got The Economist reporting that Zelensky believes his generals are hiding the truth from him and has taken to shouting at them. Now, it seemed like just a few months ago, we had some reports basically saying that, when it comes to Zelensky, you cannot tell him that he's losing. You have to paint this rosy picture of saying everything's fine, but we're getting to the point where surely his generals can't even paint that picture. How do you see these claims that are being put out there about Zelensky and I guess his fits of rage?
Well, to be honest, most leaders in war are given to fits of rage. Most leaders in war are given to yelling at their commanders. And most leaders in war are given to firing commanders that don't perform. I don't think that in itself is unusual. I'm always a little wary, and I mean, with war, to jump to conclusions and think that, well, we've had some retreats here and some advances there. We're coming close to the end. I'm not sure. I mean, we've been through this scenario a few times already over the past 2.5 years. When we had the major Russian advances in 2022, then we had the Russian retreats, and so I'm always a little wary to jump the gun and say we're close to the end, because ultimately we have to see whether Russia does make substantial advances in the Kharkov region, or whether they basically took some territory out of from which the Ukrainians would basically they were left undefended. I mean, it wasn't that. I mean, there wasn't really a battle here. There wasn't really a military defeat. The Ukrainians left it undefended. But in principle, I think it's catastrophic for Ukraine. I mean, there's no question. Everything else that we're reading about, the scale of the losses, the human losses, and the economic catastrophe. I mean, it's just terrible. But what is particularly dreadful is that there doesn't seem to be an end to this. I mean, if we could say, look, well, we're in the last stages, a few more weeks of this, and we're done, then we can say, okay, we can at least look forward to what's going to happen next. But I have a sinking feeling that we're going to have a lot more of this for a while yet.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I don't think it's something that is going to be just decided overnight. And it is interesting too when you look at what Russian President Putin has said about it, specifically about the Kharkov region, because of course we're talking about Ukraine's second largest city, and it doesn't seem like with the number of forces that Russia is putting on the battlefield, like they are trying to just take over that city. But one of the things that Putin has brought up is wanting to create this kind of cordon sanitary buffer zone, because ultimately what this comes back to is Kiev's forces and their attacks on the Donbass region, on the ethnic Russians there. How do you see Putin's strategy versus, the US, the UK? They would have gone in, taken out the government immediately on day one, and then let there be chaos. But Russia has a very different, a very slow and steady strategy. How do you view what they're doing right now with the latest advances?
Well, at this stage, Russia doesn't seem to be planning on any major military offensive and any major military operation. Going back to the way the British and the Americans were thinking, I actually thought that what Russia was doing in February 2022 was, I think, a sound enough strategy, which is basically knock over the regime in Kiev, either knock it out or force the regime in Kiev to sign an agreement. And I think that was perfectly sound strategy. It's a kind of a shock and awe. And it almost worked. I mean, we know there were negotiations in Minsk and in Istanbul, and they were close to an agreement. So the original Russian strategy worked initially, but for various reasons, then it didn't work. At this stage, Russia seems to be committed to a much more limited war. They haven't put in the kinds of forces, the numbers necessary to bring this war to a speedy conclusion. I mean, you need massive armies to take cities. You need massive armies to win battles. At this stage, it seems like what Russia is doing is trying to push out Ukrainian forces from the Donetsk and Lugansk, and then from Kherson and Zaporozhye. So it's a longish operation, but it's still limited in its scope, as opposed to, I think, what they were originally doing, which I think if you have a regime change and then you get from Kiev what Russia's original goal was, which is a Ukrainian commitment not to join NATO, a Ukrainian commitment to neutrality, a Ukrainian commitment to demilitarize. I think that was the original goal. Now, I think the goal is to free these territories, which Russia has now incorporated within the Russian Federation, to push the Ukrainian forces out of that. So that, I think, the bigger goal of securing the neutrality of Ukraine, and the demilitarization of Ukraine, I just don't think that's on the agenda any longer.
Yeah, that is good to kind of keep in mind as we continue to follow the situation. That's interesting too, how Russia's approach has been, and also how Western involvement has influenced it. Because, yeah, you saw Russia in a place, well, you've seen them in a place a number of times up until, say, March, April of 2022, of saying, hey, let's come to an agreement. Let's work this out. Both sides are going to compromise. And yet the US and the UK, under Mr. Boris Johnson at the time, they were interfering with that process, making Ukraine stay at war. And when it comes to continued, I guess you could say, interference, you also have the fact that Zelensky's term as president is technically officially up. And yet, because he has kept the country under martial law, there have not been elections like there normally would be. Could you see that adding to the unrest in the country? Obviously, the population is already frustrated with Zelensky. The latest polls have shown that he's not their pick to continue on as the president if they were able to have a pick. So where do you see things going from here?
I mean, if there's going to be internal dissent, internal strife, maybe a popular uprising, coup, or whatever, I don't think it's going to be because Zelensky has overstayed his term in office, because there is a war, and most countries don't have elections at wartime, so that's not an unreasonable excuse. On the other hand, the mobilization is obviously not at all popular. I mean, it's like people don't want to be sent to their deaths in this senseless charnel house. And so that could well lead to some kind of a collapse at home. That often happens in war. As far as the Russians are concerned, I don't think it matters very much to them. I mean, I think Putin was asked about this in Beijing. Hey, well, do you now no longer accept Zelensky as legitimate president if he's not going to run for another term in office? He says, well, it's up to the Ukrainians to decide who is their president. It's not up to us. And I think that's right. And Russia accepted Poroshenko as president, even though the legitimate ruler, Yanukovych, had been violently overthrown. So Poroshenko had no legitimacy. So it's not up to others to decide who is and who is not a legitimate ruler. But I think the question then is, can Ukraine maintain domestic morale? I mean, I'm astonished that so far they've been able to do it. I mean, you think families, they don't want to see their sons being sent to their deaths. I mean, you think they just bring this nonsense to an end. But it hasn't happened. I have to say that does astonish me.
Yeah, I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here and a lot that we are continuing to keep an eye on. And I appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down the latest here. George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Always a pleasure.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.